Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick, the president of Rethinking Foreign Policy and the author of the Cutting Through newsletter on Substack. You can subscribe to Cutting Through at mitchellplitnick.substack.com, where you can also donate to support this work. If you find this valuable, please like and share Cutting Through with your friends and contacts. It really helps to keep this going. So this video is going to be something a little different. I'm recording this on the eve of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is, strictly speaking, it's the ninth day of the month of Av in the Hebrew calendar, but it's specifically a day of mourning. It is really the day of mourning. So it would be inappropriate to call it a holiday because it's not a day about celebration. It's a day of fasting, reflection, and thinking in terms of the history of the Jewish people, and before the Jewish people, the Israelites, the Judeans, and the tragedies and difficulties that we've endured. So on Tisha B'Av, traditionally, the belief is the view is five calamities befell the Israelites. The first of them is in the Torah, and it's the story of when Moses sent 12 spies to the land of Canaan, which is, of course, Israel, Palestine today, to scope out the land and see what they thought. And of the 12, 10 of them came back with negative reports about the land, negative reports about the potential for conquering the people who were there, etc. And only two spoke well of Canaan. And God was not happy about this because the reaction of the people, the Israelites, was one of fear and despair and saying, okay, so we came all this way through the desert and now we just need to turn back and go find somewhere else to live. Showing a lack of faith in God who had steered them there. And so God said that this would be a day of tragedy for your people in the future. Did not, but and for many, this was seen as a sympathetic ruling in the sense that, God did not say, well, you don't like it, then you don't get the land. So the next tragedy was the destruction of the first temple, which is what I'm going to talk about most in this video. The next is, of course, you might guess, the destruction of Herod's temple, the second temple. In the wake of that action, the destruction of that temple by the Romans, there was the Bar Kokhba revolt several decades later that ended in a complete calamity that ended with most of the upper caste of Judea at that time that was left being dispersed, and the great diaspora, as Jews have come to see it, happen at that point. The fifth was that the Romans finally just plowed the site of the temple, of both the temples, essentially burying the holiest of holies forever until such time as the Messiah comes, and presumably it would be restored. As it happens, other tragedies in Jewish history are understood or known to have occurred on or around Tisha B'Av. These include the expulsions from England, France, and Spain, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. More recently, the approval for the final solution in Nazi Germany was supposedly handed to Heinrich Himmler on Tisha B'Av. The deportation of the Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp happened on Tisha B'Av. And most recently, the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994 also happened around Tisha B'Av. But in 2025, when we think about the calamity of the world that we're living in, unfortunately, as painful as this is for so many people, and as hard as it is, and as for the moment at least, as impossible as it is for some Jews to reckon with this and acknowledge this, we are not the victims at this time of calamity. We're the perpetrators of it. At least the state of Israel is. And I want to make very clear all Jews are not responsible for what the state of Israel does, even all Israelis. There are Israelis who have been opposed to the genocide in Gaza from day one. That number has grown. There is still quite a bit of support in Israel for the genocide of Gaza. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The polls are very clear. Even many of the people who want the so-called war to end, mostly that is because they are tired of it. They think that it's a waste, and they see that Israel is suffering a lot of losses in terms of its international standing, and soldiers are getting killed, as are the hostages. So they want, that remains the prime motivation. But it is also fair to say that there is a significant growth in the number of Israelis who see that the suffering in Gaza is intolerable. So, we should not, and so I want to make it clear, and I want to make this very clear up front. When I'm talking about Israel broadly, I'm talking about the Jewish people broadly. It is certainly not all. Obviously, I, as a Jewish man, do not think I am responsible for the genocide in Gaza, that I have been vocally and doing all I can vocally opposing and doing all I can in my humble capacity to stop since the day it started. So, it is, and it is certainly true that many Jews have spoken out against the genocide, but it doesn't change the fact that there is a state that purports to be a Jewish state. And let's face it, a lot of the global Jewish community does live in Israel, about half. And many of those of us who do live outside of Israel have been actively supporting it. The community, when we think of organized Jews, we think of what we call, certainly in the United States, major Jewish institutions. They have been doing all they can to make sure that Israel has a completely free hand and is not restrained by anyone. Only recently have some of them realized that Israel has maybe gone too far with what they have advocated, and have made some sort of half-hearted declarations that Israel should maybe, allow more aid into Gaza and try and kill a few less than the hundreds of civilians they're killing every day. I don't find these statements very convincing, but you can decide that for yourselves. But in any case, there's no question that the organized so-called mainstream, or if you prefer, legacy Jewish institutions have played a significant role in this. And this has to be reckoned with, including by those of us who are, or maybe especially by those of us who are Jewish, and as Jews are called to oppose genocide everywhere, and have been opposing this genocide as strenuously as any. So, the events, and we need to come back to this because, on the one hand, we don't want to constantly come back to October 7th, because it somehow, even bringing it up in this context, can legitimize for some people the idea that there was a reason or justification for the things Israel has done. Israel's immediate response was to attack the civilian population of Gaza. It was the first thing Yoav Golan said. Okay, cutting off food, water, and electricity to the entire Gaza Strip because the people who live there are human animals is not targeting Hamas. It is targeting the civilian population. That is what Israel has done from day one. That is what has been supported by the United States from day one. So there was, and October 7th, as horrific as it was, did not justify that. Yet October 7th does have to be remembered for the horror that it was. Even though from the very first day that basically Israel and its supporters have repeated the mantra that nothing can justify October 7th, and explicitly or implicitly argued that October 7th then justifies any response Israel sees fit, including genocide by mass starvation. And none of that is acceptable or true. October 7th did not happen in a vacuum, nor did it come out of nowhere. It was the inevitable result. And yes, inevitable result, not justified result, but inevitable result of decades of dispossession by a settler colonial project that created an apartheid state and held millions of people under a brutal occupation that robbed them of dignity, hope, and all too often, life and limb. And again, we should differentiate between what is acceptable and what is inevitable. When you do this to people, they will react in ways that are unacceptable, that are not okay, that are extremely violent. But that is what happens. Again, I will refer to the article I wrote not long after the genocide started, where I brought up the Nat Turner slave revolt, the Powhatan tribe that attacked the settlers in the colonies in Virginia and Jamestown. Atrocities were committed in those acts, horrible atrocities where innocents, including children, were killed. And that wasn't justified by anything that was happening. It's not ever justified. But when we look throughout history, we can look at Algeria, we can look at all sorts of cases. Horrible crimes happen when you treat people in this way, when you dispossess people, when you take away their freedom, their livelihood, rob them of hope. This is what happens. It's not a question of is it justified. It is inevitable. It is what always happens. That is the human condition. It was going to happen at some point. And I, like many others, I was certainly not special in this, warned for year after year after year, publicly, as loudly as we could, that a horrible thing would happen if Israel did not change its ways, if Israel did not change its policies. Our warnings didn't just fall on deaf ears, because when those same deaf ears heard the cries of Israelis on October 7th, killed by Palestinians or killed by friendly fire, as a significant number were, they asked, why didn't anyone warn us? As if the warnings had not been there from Palestinians who understood that they themselves were not going to take that kind of action, but they saw around them people who saw no other choice, who saw no other way to strike back. They knew that it was brewing for years. We knew. It didn't take a genius. It just took a willingness to look and to listen. And they refused to do it, and then asked why nobody told them that something like that was coming. Where did this come from? It came out of nowhere. We hear the garbage that Israel advocacy organizations spew out on a regular basis, that there was peace on October 6th. There was not peace. It wasn't even peace for Israelis, by the way, but there was certainly no peace for Palestinians, and certainly, most of all, not in Gaza. The conditions in Gaza and in the West Bank had been declining significantly for decades, consistently, whether Palestinians attacked or not, whether Palestinians protested or not. It was completely independent of Palestinian action that those conditions were getting worse and worse, more and more oppressive, more and more violent, more and more hopeless. And Israel made it clear they had no intention of stopping. The Netanyahu government, which now is the, one way, in one form or another, Netanyahu has been leading the Israeli government for longer than any prime minister in Israel's history, said, well, we're not going to even talk about a two-state solution. They didn't say until recently that the two-state solution was completely off the table, but they did say, and this is before October 7th again, they did say, well, it can't be done now. We're going to kick the can down the road, and until then, we're going to manage the occupation. As if Israel had the right to decide when Palestinians could have the basic rights that everyone is entitled to. When you have that kind of attitude, bad things are going to happen, and they did on October 7th. And Israel used that to create a genocide that is the worst of this century, as one former U.S. official, Martin Griffiths, recently a UN official, I'm not sure if I spoke that right, United Nations, Martin Griffiths recently said this is the worst crime of the 21st century. He's right. And it's the worst crime in a very, very long time. that is how Israel responded to all of this. And Israel cannot pass off the idea that this happened in defense. It was not defense. It was not. I mean, we can get into the issue of international law and when an occupying power, whether an occupying power has the right to self-defense that Israel continues to claim. And by the way, it doesn't. But that's not even the case. Even if it did, it wouldn't justify anything that's happened since October 7th. Not only that, Israel and the United States have cut off all diplomatic recourse. I mean, just this week, Donald Trump sanctioned the quisling Palestinian Authority and PLO because they went to international courts, ICJ and ICC, because there was no other option. They were blocked from every other diplomatic avenue, and now they are apparently blocked from this one unless they, again, want to have even more sanctions put on them. When you block diplomacy, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think people are going to do? Say, oh, well, there's just nothing we can do and we'll just live with our misery. That's not how it works. So on Tisha B'Av, we read the book of Eichah. It's known in English as Lamentations. Eichah deals with the aftermath of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. Eichah is an interesting book. There's sort of multiple narrative tones that I think I read anyway as multiple narrators. There is one that's sort of a general narration. There is a narration that is the personification of Jerusalem that has just been destroyed. There's parts that are narrated by the people of Yehuda, Judah, if Judea, that as people like to call it in English, and even God is a narrator in parts of Eichah. And the perspectives shift as well from bemoaning the sins of the people of Yehuda, those sins that brought God's retribution, God's anger that he used, invading Babylonians as tools to carry out. And then there's other times when, it's more accusatory of God, where God is the villain. God shows a lack of mercy, a lack of understanding. Is just lashes out at his people. And yet another tone where there's a sort of understanding of why God did that, and seeing the punishment as harsh but just, and ultimately necessary to repair the covenant that the people of Yehuda broke and bring the people to a more sort of, I guess you'd say, enlightened state. So Eichah has, over time, come to play a very significant role in Jewish identity, even for secular Jews. The concept of Jewish history as, stories of persecution and victimization, which certainly dominates quite a bit of Jewish history, although not all. Let's, keep in mind that there was a united, or at least, in terms of the history mixed with myth, that national understanding or Jewish, I guess, understanding of our history that says there was a united kingdom of Israel that had split into Yehuda and Israel. That were significant regional powers for a time. So it wasn't always tales of persecution. But certainly that's been the bulk. We've been a minority in a diaspora community for most of our history. That's usually going to bring bigotry and persecution, and it has. And so Eichah comes to define Jews as a people in that way. Now, that definition is based to some extent, at least, on faith, and reading of the Torah and the Talmud, and the Midrash, and for secular people, myself included, although I come from a religious background, I'm certainly identified now as a secular Jew. These are academic ideas, fascinating and important in a sort of sociological sense in approaching the Jewish people, but but still kind of academic in terms of the world we're living in now. But I think there's a lot of relevance in Eichah. And I think that relevance doesn't come from reading it the way we have traditionally read it, but rather understanding Eichah in a very different light. Because reading Eichah during the Gaza genocide, and I think this will need to be the way we read Eichah, certainly for some time after the Gaza genocide, we are the visiting ruthless attackers, savaging another people. We are the ones who are carrying out these horrible acts. In all of Eichah, the attackers who sacked Jerusalem are never portrayed as innocent tools of God. Whichever point of view and whichever sort of narrative tone is being taken, the attackers are always enemies. They're not the messengers of God in any way. Certainly, at least in terms of the Babylonians, and I think that's true in general. There is anger at God for allowing this woe to come upon the people of Yehuda, but there's no absolution for the Babylonians, just because they were attacking. What God essentially did was it created a condition that they could be successful. And in Eichah, the attackers, and this is not unique in any way to Eichah or to Tanakh or to the Talmud or to Judaism. This is very common in many mythologies, especially ones that are very central to given cultures. The attackers are faceless enemies, right? They're not fully developed characters. We don't ask how they came to hate Yehuda, how the Babylonians came to want to do the things that they did. Did they have justifiable complaints? Did it develop? Was there propaganda about it? Were the soldiers told some horrible stories by the king Nebuchadnezzar? They are presented without that sort of full characterization. It's typical. It's nothing, and yet in real life and in the present and in the moment, the people who do that sort of attacking, in this case, the Israelis, we rationalize. Like humans, that's what humans do. And, maybe at the time, the Babylonians had their own rationalizations. Maybe, whether it was the king or the soldiers, maybe they had their own ways of convincing themselves that their actions were just. I don't know. It's a long time ago, and there's no way to know such a thing. But in the case of Israel tells the world that the world owes the so-called Jewish state, and I certainly challenge that characterization of Israel, but that the world owes Israel a free hand because of Jewish history. It says, "Look upon the blood of our people spilled on October 7th. Women assaulted, hundreds shot, some who were fleeing, people killed in homes and in shelters from which there was no escape. All of that is true. All of that happened. All of that is criminal and horrific and horrible." But with those words, Israel laid siege to Gaza right away. And in the intervening 22 months, Israel has killed tens of thousands of innocents. 17,000 children are known to have died from Israeli attacks. And who could say how many more have died from disease, lack of clean water, lack of decent nutrition, lack of medicine, even before this current campaign of starvation. And this is our Eichah today. This is our lamentation today. We must, those of us with conscience, must lament the deaths of these Palestinian children, of these Palestinian babies, of these Palestinian innocents who are dying because of, frankly, the cruelty of Israel, of the fanaticism, of the nationalistic fervor in Israel. This is what Eichah means now. It's not limited to the more than 60,000 confirmed dead in Gaza. It's not only the many others who have died from ancillary causes or have not been registered in the official count because they haven't been found. They're buried under rubble. It goes back to the very root of the modern state of Israel. It goes back to the mythology that Zionist immigration was built on this myth of a land without a people for a people without a land. Because the reality was what Echad Ha'am said at the time, the guy who historically is known as the father of what was called cultural Zionism. Because his statement was, the bride is beautiful, but she's betrothed to another. In other words, yeah, there are people. It's not a land without a people. And of course, over the course of the 20th century, the Arab population of Palestine grew considerably. Of course, when there was investment in Palestine, which under the Ottomans there had not been, people came there for jobs. These people were often members of the family from other areas nearby. But whatever you want to describe it, of course, the population grew. It doesn't change anything. Okay, doesn't change the fact that the land of Palestine was Palestinian, and it was lived on by Palestinians for generation upon generation upon generation. And this was a problem for the Zionist movement. Our Eichah goes back to Yosef Weitz and to Chaim Weizmann and other Zionist leaders, up to and very much including David Ben-Gurion, who understood that while it might be possible to share the land, the Jewish state that they envisioned was not possible if a clear majority of the citizens were not Jewish. And let's remember, the 1947 partition plan by the United Nations would have created a Jewish state that was nearly half non-Jewish. The majority of that state would almost certainly have been non-Jewish within a matter of years, and not many years. So that wasn't what Ben-Gurion was after. He needed more than just a majority in 1948, but a wide enough majority that those demographics could not shift over the years. This wasn't so much about borders. It was about demographics. That was the issue. That was the big issue. I mean, of course, the borders were important to the Zionist movement as well. But it was the vision of a strong Jewish majority that was such a big deal. Our Eichah goes back to the refusal to live up to the understandings that the United Nations had with the Yishuv when they were helping to create the state of Israel and give it international legitimacy, to abide by a UN, the understanding that Israel would abide by the UN resolution to resolve the war of 1948. By allowing those who fled to return to their homes, which is not uncommon that people do that. Yes, there are refugees after every war, but we have now international law that says refugees can go back to their homes, and this was something that the UN, as a global unit, as a world, said has to happen if we're going to agree to acknowledge the Jewish state. Israel did not, in the end, do that, obviously. Our Eichah goes back to the occupation and the drive to control the West Bank, which is, and I think this gets lost when people talk about how, well, they'll give the West Bank to the Palestinians. I don't think people realize just what a big deal that really is. The West Bank is Eretz Yisrael. When we talk about the biblical Eretz Yisrael, Yehuda and Shomron, these names come from the kingdoms of Israel and Judea, the area of Judah and Samaria. Judea and Samaria are the key areas in Eretz Yisrael. For both religious Zionists and nationalist Zionists, that is a huge deal. It always has been. This idea that Israel can easily give that up, even if Israel, even if there were, and there are Israelis certainly who are willing to give that up in exchange for, for finally settling all of this conflict. But the idea that the real nationalist core of the Zionist movement and of Israel was going to do that was always absurd. Once they had a hold of it in 1967, it was not going to be that easy. It was going to take an enormous global effort to get them to give it back, and the world was never prepared to make that kind of effort. Because when we talk about Jewish nationalism, that's the heart of it. The West Bank is the heart of it. There's no Tel Aviv in the Torah. You know, there is Jericho. There's the the occupation became its own sort of monster to control, but it was never going to be so easily reversed. And it only got more and more entrenched. The opportunity to reverse the occupation was in 1967, when even people like Ben Gurion said it's not worth holding on to it, because it's just going to be too many problems. We want Jerusalem, but we'll give up the rest. That was Ben Gurion's stance. Ben Gurion was no longer in power. But that's what he believed, or at least that's what he said. Our Eichah also goes to the very heart of the settler colonial Zionist project. People don't like that term. People don't like to hear it. Sorry, that's what it is. These words have meaning. They have definitions. By definition, Israel is a settler colonial project. Okay. And you could say, well, that delegitimizes Israel. Well, does it delegitimize the United States? Does it delegitimize Canada, Mexico? Does it delegitimize Australia? I mean, we can look all over the world. There are settler colonial states. If we go back far enough, people emigrated from here to there, and sometimes people came along later and displaced those people who had been in that place. The history of the world has this. Israel is not unique in being a settler colonial state by any means. Israel is simply is unique in denying that's what it is. And this idea that all these Europeans and Jews from around the Middle East and other places were entitled to come back, that this was actually their native land, is an absurdity that has no basis in any sort of legal, political, or historical precedent. Sorry, it doesn't. You can argue it all you want. I mean, but it doesn't. You can argue that the sun rises in the west too. These are simple facts. Israel is a settler colonial project. And that settler colonial project was not based on coexistence, but on dispossession. It was not based on universal rights, but on the concept of the Iron Wall. The Iron Wall, which was eventually adopted, as the historian Avi Shlaim makes very, very clear, and I think provides a conclusive a conclusive argument for. The Iron Wall was the idea of Zev Jabotinsky, who was the leader of the revisionists, which eventually became what is today the Likud coalition, the Zionist right. He was sort of a proto-fascist leader, and he didn't have a problem with that label. He believed that there was possibly a way to have peace between the natives, the Palestinians, and the Zionist immigrants. But he was very clear: we are trying to take their land from them. They don't like us, and they are not going to like us. That was his argument. The labor movement said, no, we're going to show them how it's good, and we'll pay some of them to leave, and we'll show them how we'll make things better for them, and all this. And Jabotinsky was like, no, we're here to take their land, and they're going to hate that because anybody would. But he also said, once we convince them that they can't beat us by force of arms, we can come to an arrangement where they will have citizenship, a sort of second-class citizenship, although I think his vision of second-class citizenship was probably considerably better than what Palestinians today in Israel enjoy. Maybe it would have been, maybe it wouldn't have been. That's academic. But that was what he said. So it was never based on equality. And his idea was adopted eventually by labor, even if not officially. But in terms of, you can see in their actions that that's where they went. The concept of the Iron Wall, which was this, sort of just, you cannot beat us. We are going to be so much stronger than you militarily that you will despair of beating us. That was certainly adopted by labor, and you can see it throughout the history of Israel. And our Eichah goes from there to the establishment of an apartheid state. and managing the occupation, which by definition meant that the rights accorded by default to people in Israel and in much of the world as citizens of a state were denied to the Palestinians. Rights of citizenship, which people have even in non-democratic states, Palestinians don't even have that. They have no recourse whatsoever to a government that has any real control over their lives. The idea that the Hamas administration in Gaza or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank ever had any real control over the Palestinian lives is an illusion. It's always been Israel. Ultimately, Israel meant instituting a reality where violence, humiliation, degradation, and hopelessness were the lot of any Palestinian who remained in Palestine. Only by emigrating could a Palestinian ever hope to have a truly full life. And so you had to choose between hope and your homeland. That was the choice. And it's still the choice that Israel gives to the Palestinians. And in fact, it's even starker now. In Gaza, the entire concept of everything, and Netanyahu's basically said this. He talked about, well, we want to give Palestinians freedom of choice. I mean, his concept of freedom of choice is you stay here and die, or you leave and live. That's what his choice is. That is what he said. If you look carefully at what's going on the ground and look at his words. When you do that to people, when that's the choice that you give people in life, it always will lead to ugly and criminal and horrific consequences that hurt civilians. That's what happens. It's always happened. It always will happen. Doesn't mean it's okay. It means it's inevitable. In 2025, Eichah must be read by us on Tisha B'Av, not as the victims of the sacking of Jerusalem, but as the enemy, as the Babylonians, not the people of Yehuda. We are the Babylonians now. That's what is happening in Gaza. The people of Yehuda are the people of Gaza. And that's how we need to understand our lamentations on Tisha B'Av. We need to grieve for the people of Gaza, and we need to grieve for ourselves and what we've become. And it's important, I think, that for me, that I use that term we, not they. It's not those Jews over there, because we are all the Jewish people. It isn't those Jews over there. I am not responsible for their actions, but I'm still part of the Jewish people. And their actions bring shame on me. And their actions make my life less secure, if I'm looking at it just from a selfish point of view. But their actions splash blood everywhere, and it splashes on me too, as much as I stand and try to oppose the genocide in Gaza. To the people of Gaza, if our Eichah is to mean anything, we have to atone, and the way we start by atoning, of course, is by stopping these crimes. And I don't just mean, although obviously the most immediate need is to stop the campaign of starvation and slaughter at aid sites and daily bombings and herding people into so-called safe zones where they're then bombed again, and forcing people to go to get aid where they're turned into target practice. That has to stop. That's the first thing. But we have to stop all the crimes. We have to stop everything that's going on in the West Bank. We have to stop a situation where the Palestinians do not have the rights that every individual is entitled to according to our values. I'm thinking that you who are listening to this, understand those values and share those values, that everybody has basic human rights. That's the first thing. After that, the next step, we have to make as much amends as we possibly can. Look, we cannot bring the dead back to life. And the truth is, we cannot rebuild Gaza. We cannot rebuild the many Palestinian villages, the hundreds of Palestinian villages that were destroyed in 1948 and 1967. And since then, the many Palestinian homes that are gone, We can't, and we can't unwind history. The people of Israel live in Israel. You know, we need to find, a way forward that makes amends as much as there can be and serves as much justice as we can find. That has to happen. And that means accountability for those who have committed crimes, and there's a lot of them. It means a truth and reconciliation process. It means acknowledging the crimes that the Zionist movement and the state of Israel have committed against the Palestinian people. And when that's done, the Jewish people of Israel and the Palestinian people of Palestine can come together and chart the future for themselves in a forum that is equal, where they each have an equal say. The Eichah perhaps that we in the United States have to do is to promote that equality, is to promote the idea that what Israelis want and what Israeli Jews want and Palestinian Arabs want carries equal weight. And that each side also has equal responsibility for their own actions. And all that implies for the crimes of dispossession, occupation, apartheid, settler colonialism. There's a lot of lamentation to do, and it's growing every hour. It can change. It must change. But if Eichah is to have any meaning, it can't just be a book that we read on Tisha B'Av. It has to actuate itself in the real world. And the first way it has to do that is by stopping the killing in Gaza. So thank you for listening. Again, if you can support this work in any way, it will be deeply appreciated. Please share and share this video with all your networks. Sorry, I'm a little bit more emotional at the end of this than usual, but anything you can do to support will be helpful and appreciated, and allow me to continue to doing this work. So thank you very much. Those of you who do observe Tisha B'Av, I wish you an easy fast.